Good afternoon, Facebook and YouTube. Thank you so much for joining us for season 3, episode 2 of Black Writers Read. My name is Nicole Young Martin, and I serve as a producer and host for this series. And as always, I am coming to you from my home office in Northern Connecticut, actually on day 6 of recovering from COVID. So, my apologies. I might cough a few times during today's conversation. And as many of you may hear, I am extremely congested and I lack my usual full voice. So, but we're still going to do it today because I'm here and ready to go. Black Writers Read showcases, celebrates, and honors the words, work, and traditions of Black writers from across the country, across genres, across experiences, and across the African diaspora. Black Writers Read is a behind-the-scenes conversation into the craft and what it means to create as a Black author in today's society. Since starting the series during the summer of 2020, we've hosted over 40 authors representing various genres, including children's books, young adult fiction, poetry, urban creative nonfiction, memoir, history, horror, essays, food, and culture from around the globe, including Western Massachusetts, Los Angeles, Washington, D.C., upstate New York, Vermont, Cambridge, Massachusetts, and Portugal. Today, we welcome fiction, poetry, narrative, nonfiction author Nikesha Elise Williams joining us from Jacksonville, Florida. I am so excited to add the U.S. South to our docket. She's going to be chatting with us today about her new nonfiction book, Mardi Gras Indians, which is scheduled for release on October 5th and is published by Louisiana State University Press. Mardi Gras Indians explores how sacred and secular expressions of Carnival throughout the African diaspora came together in a gumbo-sized melting pot to birth one of the most unique traditions celebrating African culture, Indigenous peoples, and Black Americans. Williams ties together the fragments of the ancient traditions with the expressed experiences of the contemporary. From the sangamento of the Congolese and the calumet of the various tribes of the lower Mississippi River Valley to one-on-one interviews with today's Black masking tribe members, this book highlights the spirit of resistance and rebellion upon which this culture was built. Today's guest, Nikesha Elise Williams, is a two-time Emmy Award-winning producer, an award-winning author and producer and host of her own podcast, Black and Published, which I hope you get an opportunity to subscribe and listen. It is on season 3 as well. Mardi Gras Indians, of course, again, will be published on October 5th, so please make sure to pre-order your copy today from LSU Press. Nikesha's latest novel, Beyond Bourbon Street, was awarded Best Fiction by the Black Caucus of African American Librarians in the 2021 Self-Published eBook Literary Awards. It also received the 2020 Outstanding Book Award from the National Association of Black Journalists. A Chicago native, Nikesha is an editor at Narrative Initiative and a columnist with Jax Today. Her work has also appeared in the Washington Post, Essence, and Vox. She lives in Florida with her family, where she is working on her next novel. To learn more about Nikesha and her expansive body of work, please visit her website, which is www.newwrites.com. And her website is her initials, newwrites.com. For those of you who are new to Black Writers Read, here's the format of our show. First, Nikesha will read an excerpt from Mardi Gras Indians. Afterwards, we'll engage in a conversation, and then we'll open up to Q&A from all of our viewers. We have viewers joining us today from both Facebook and YouTube. So if you have a question, please feel free to include it in the comment section on the platform where you are joining us today. I will compile the questions and post them to Nikesha following our conversation. I'd now like to welcome Nikesha onto the virtual stage. Hello.
Hey, Nicole.
So great to finally meet you.
You too. Thank you for having me. I truly appreciate it.
Yeah, especially at the beginning of your book launch and book tour, which I hope you have tons of dates booked and tons of exposure booked for yourself.
We're trying.
Yes. And Nikesha, now we had a chance to talk before we jumped on today. Please make sure you subscribe to her podcast because she will talk more about her book on the episode that will be posted this coming Tuesday. So, Nikesha, take it away.
All right, so I'm going to read for you guys from the preface of Mardi Gras Indians, which kind of explains how this book came to be before we jump into the nitty-gritty with Nicole. Food is my love language. The first inklings of this text began with food, specifically my love for New Orleans style red beans and rice. A personal essay I wrote about that dish led to me being contacted by LSU Press regarding their project of publishing books about different aspects of Louisiana culture. An unsolicited query in my inbox asked, "Are you interested?" "Of course," I responded. However, I didn't want to write about food as I had done in other essays. I knew immediately that I wanted to write about the Indians, but I agreed to look at the list of subjects the press wanted to cover before making a final decision. As a New Orleanian once removed, similar to how author and journalist Isabel Wilkerson referred to herself in her book, The Warmth of Other Suns, I shared the list with my mother, a New Orleans native. She said, "The only thing on this list I know I can help you with is the Indians." Her statement in March 2020 solidified what I would be writing about. I began my preliminary research with Google. The search engine immediately spat back at me dozens of newspaper stories on Mardi Gras and COVID. The global pandemic was still in its nascent stages in the United States. When I started this preliminary search to write the book proposal, Ronald W. Lewis was still alive. By the time I finished the proposal and submitted it in early April, he had died. The news of his death led me deeper into my family, as Ronald W. Lewis was the uncle of my cousin, Brent Taylor. As the news of my project spread through my family like hot gossip after Sunday service, my father, also a New Orleans native, as well as aunts and cousins, all suggested names I should look up and people I should speak with. My father's suggestion? "You gotta watch the documentary Tootie's Last Suit. Tootie was the prettiest Indian ever." My Aunt Mary Ryan said, "My next door neighbor, Charmin, her nephew is a big chief. His name is Romeo. You gotta get in contact with him. He's on Facebook." Other names I wanted to follow up on were those I kept seeing in the results of my Google search: Bo Dallas and Donald Harrison. Though both men had already passed, their children were still carrying on the tradition. From my home in Jacksonville, Florida, I planned a trip to New Orleans in the middle of a global pandemic. I set up visits to archives and made preliminary contact with Romeo, the Mardi Gras Indian Council, as well as the Backstreet Cultural Museum. I planned to wing the rest of it once I got on the ground in the city. My mother flew from Chicago to Florida. Then we drove the 8 hours on I-10 from Jacksonville to New Orleans. Once in the city, Stafford Aggie came to my Aunt Mary's house in the 7th Ward to interview with me in the basement. I contacted Bo Dallas Jr. via Instagram, and he agreed to let me interview him at his townhouse in the East. My cousin Tanya Deavy put me in touch with Keelian Boyd, whom she'd known for years. When I arrived at the home of his cousin Charles Duvernay, I interviewed them first before calling in their spouses. Another cousin, Lamone Morris, introduced me to Ronnell Butler. It was while I was out with Lamone that I caught up with my cousin Brent at Ronald W. Lewis's home. Though his wife was still grieving and didn't want to interview with me, she and Brent did allow me to walk through the museum and take notes and pictures as I pleased. During this walkthrough, I met Gilbert Cosmo Dave. He too was still grieving the loss of his best friend, but he agreed to open his heart and speak to me about the culture and the tradition. While still at the House of Dance and Feathers, Romeo messaged me that he was finally ready to talk. My interview with Sharice Harrison Nelson took place after my trip to New Orleans, as she was busy during my time there and did not want to meet in person because of COVID precautions. At the time of my visit, she participated in the memorial service for the late Joe Jenkins. However, this cadre of interviews didn't provide me with enough material to write a book on a culture and tradition whose history spans centuries. During my visit to the Amistad Research Center, I was able to dig through the donated items from the Harrison family, many of which hadn't even been cataloged yet. It was there that I watched their family-produced documentary from the 1990s and received a link to watch the Maurice Martinez documentary from 1976. During my time digging through the archives of the Historic New Orleans collection in the French Quarter, I returned to Google to find more primary sources. I ordered every book I could find: Geraldine DeWolf's From the Kingdom of Congo to Congo Square, the biographies of Donald Harrison Sr. and Robert Nathaniel Lee by Al Kennedy, Giacomo, The Native Roots of Mardi Gras Indians by Shane Leaf and John McCusker, Congo Square in New Orleans by Jira Johnson, which I initially started reading in the archives, Freedom's Dance with photographs by Eric Waters and narrative text by Karen Celestin, and Mardi Gras Indians by Michael P. Smith, a book so rare the first time I searched for it that a book so rare that the first time I searched for it, it was priced at $120. The secondhand copy I eventually purchased with someone else's name scrawled in marker on the inside still cost me $65. I also picked up Ronald W. Lewis's book, published in conjunction with the Neighborhood Story Project during my jaunt with my cousin Lamone. And I ordered Victor Harris's book, also published with the Neighborhood Story Project, months later. With these sources and interviews, I began reading and making notes. The history of the Indians I found mostly in the text from DeWolf and Leaf and McCusker. The latter led me to the historic newspaper articles that detailed the exploits of the Indians during Mardi Gras. Johnson's book helped to put into context the importance of Congo Square and how convergence upon the square by African and Indigenous people led to the intermixing and syncretizing of culture to birth the Black masking Indians. Meanwhile, the biographies of Donald Harrison Sr. and Robert Nathaniel Lee, as well as the documentary Tootie's Last Suit, gave first-person accounts from Indians who masked in the early days of the formal culture. With these interviews, oral histories, documentaries, and other primary sources, I knew, as I stated in my proposal, that I had to dig into the history, but it became clear early in my research that the history would always be a mixed and muddled grouping of assumptions and assertions loosely held together by disparate corroborating documents. The history was no longer the crux of my questioning. My focus was this: how did this tradition survive? How is it still surviving? My thesis question was no longer when or why, but how. For me, the evolution became much more important than the origin. In this book, I have attempted to thread the needle between history and evolution as closely as possible using the resources available, most notably firsthand accounts. The culture of Black masking Indians is an oral tradition, and I hope you will find that in this book, the voices of Indians past and present have been heard. I'll stop there.
Thank you so much. This makes me even more excited to read the story. And what's really cool is, even though I don't have any cultural origins in New Orleans, I was very familiar with a lot of the people that you mentioned. One, because one of my favorite musicians, and I'm going to butcher his name, Christian Scott Adetunde, he talks. I saw him play in concert a couple of years ago, and he mentioned all of those names and the breadth of the stories. And I'm just like, yay. So I love that you are continuing a tradition of telling these stories of very important people of your heritage.
Yeah, Christian Scott's grandfather is Donald Harrison Sr.
Right.
Yeah, so he comes from a long line of Black people who've masked Indian.
Nice. So the first question I have for you, Nikesha, and I'm gonna doctor it up a little bit because you offered a lot regarding the origins of the story. Can you talk a little bit more about how the book emerged from, like, talk about your journey choosing which archives to go to, talk about like the people that you chose to go to first, and kind of how you came to what the narrative is now, which is a combination, which I love, of primary and secondary sources.
It was really organic. I didn't approach this with the mindset of an academic or historian because I'm neither of those things. I'm a journalist. And so as a journalist, you think about who do you go talk to now, right? And so that was why I said, okay, I need to go to New Orleans. Let me plan a trip. But I knew to tell the history of the culture, I needed to, find some historical artifacts, texts, and some of those elements that I wouldn't get from people who are masking now. And so that's why I was like, okay, well, we're in a global pandemic, so I can't go far, and I can't go a lot of places, and I can't go everywhere. I have to kind of be central. So I was like, okay, we're going to go to New Orleans, and I'm going to find what I can find. And so I knew of the Homicide Research Center, which is the archives connected to Tulane University. And then I knew of the historic New Orleans connection, the Historic New Orleans Collection, which is an archives that's located in the French Quarter. And so those were the two that kept coming up anytime I would Google a name or a history or a date or anything. So I'm like, okay, these are the two places that I need to go. And then once I called both archives and spoke to people there, And they were like, okay, we'll send you a bunch of links of how to get into our system to search what you need. So that way, when you get here, we'll just bring out all the things that you requested to look through, which is what I did. And because my parents were from New Orleans, you know, as soon as they started telling their friends and my family members that I was writing this book and it was like going to be a real thing, then everybody started to have names and stuff. So like when we got to New Orleans, I think my son, my mother, and I, we got in on a Friday for me to start my research the coming Monday. So like have a weekend to just, you know, be out in the city, hang out, meet folks, hang out with family, do that type of stuff. And when we got in that day, I think we went to my aunt's house who lives in the 7th ward. And no lie, like my cousin was there, called up a guy on her phone, Stafford, and was like, "You about to come interview with my cousin right now, or I'm gonna beat you up." Just like just all kinds of wrong, like just threatening people. So he was like, "Let me come over right now and get this out the way before I forget." And so like we did the interview right there in his basement. I wasn't prepared at all, but we did it. And then like my cousins called other friends. It's like, "Okay, she's gonna come meet you at your house, and don't worry, she got a funny accent, but it's gonna be all right." Like it was really like that. I literally slid into Bo Dallas's DMs and was like, "Hey, I'm in town and I'm writing this book now. I want to meet you and I want to talk to you." And he was like, "Yeah, come through, come to my townhouse." And I was like, "Okay,
Yes.
And then like I think the last day that I was there with my cousin Lamone, he just came and scooped me up. We went down to Ronald W. Lewis's house because he has a museum called the House of Dance and Feathers. And like I said, he was the uncle of my other cousin, Brent. And so we went, and his wife didn't want to talk. She was still grieving. They were actually getting ready to hold a second line for him like that weekend, because even though he had passed in like late March, April, you couldn't have funeral services and you couldn't do second lines in the city because of COVID. So like by July, this was the first time that they were able to like really do a procession for him. And he was really a gatekeeper of culture in the city. And so I was able to walk through the museum, see all the exhibits, do that type of stuff, pick up the book. And then his friend Cosmo came through, and my cousin was, "Oh, there go Cosmo right there. You need to talk to him." And I was like, "Okay." So I talked to Cosmo, and then we had gone by his this other guy's house, Ronell, who was my cousin's barber, but who also masked Indian. And so he's cutting hair and we talking and having a conversation. And then the other guy who I had talked to before I even got into the city, Romeo, he was back and forth about whether or not he wanted to do an interview with me, but he finally texted me. He was like, "All right, you can come over." And so then we went by his house. So it was really a very organic, familial type of situation that came together for me to get the primary interviews. And then as far as, you know, the secondary sources or the books that had already been written, the research, as I mentioned in the preface, is like, there's not a lot.
Right.
Like this history, this culture is an oral tradition. So most of the information is passed down from generation to generation to generation, because masking is something that is done within families or within neighborhoods. So, you know, they don't have to ask the history and the origins because they know, because they've been growing up with it. So it's usually outsiders, people who are not from New Orleans, who are not part of second line culture, who see it and are curious, who want to write these stories. And so most of the books that I got and used as like those secondary sources were written by white men, with the exception of Freedom's Dance, written by a Black woman, and also along with a Black photographer. Yeah. So as I said, there aren't a lot of like books to get. There are documentaries, like Maurice Martinez's documentaries from 1976 was a good one. There's another documentary from 2003, All on a Mardi Gras Day, by Royce Osborne. And then there's a documentary, Tootie's Last Suit, by Lisa Katzman. And there's other things that are coming out from people who are embedded in the culture. I know you mentioned Christian Scott, one of Donald Harrison's grandchildren. I believe his brother, Kiel, they're twins. Yes. But I believe his brother was has a fine arts degree in film and is doing a film about the women who mask Indian. So like there's stuff that's coming out, but because it's an insular community and it's an oral tradition and they hold it sacred. So they don't really allow a lot of outsiders to come in and talk to them and do what I did. And if you read a lot of the historical texts, the books outside of the biographies that were written about Donald Harrison Sr. and Big Chief Robbie Lee, most of those books rely on research in history, not first person interviews.
Oh, wow.
So what I've done has built upon the research that exists and adds to it by putting in the voices of people who are masking today. And I think that's what makes it stand out.
Yeah, and that's the part that I'm extremely excited about. And that's such a great way to transition to my next question, because not only is it uniquely nonfiction, but you were able to gather stories from people who may not want it to be documented in this way. So, how were you able to craft like the full narrative, like the story of, Mardi Gras Indians, given how you collected these stories? And then I hope my question makes sense. And then, like, this is an add-on. What is it that you want the reader to learn about these communities through reading this text, especially given the access that you had?
I think the way that I was able to craft the story was, as I said, no longer focusing on the history, but focusing on the evolution. Because through colonization, slavery,
Mhm.
and the genocide of indigenous communities in the United States, a lot of that history is lost, right? And so what remains is a mixture of folklore and conjecture, along with the seeds of what happened and how it came to be. So, yes, we can say that and know definitively that Africans were brought to New Orleans and enslaved. And because New Orleans was initially a French colony, and because of how difficult it was for the white settlers, colonizers, to farm the land, that is why they initially gave slaves Saturday and Sunday off, and forced them to work, because they were forced to also feed themselves. So that is why you have that function. And so out of the function of the enslaved working, and they were able to maintain some of their culture and convene on Congo Square, where the drumming remained, and they were able to keep a lot of their African and indigenous practices. But because you had this happening in an area that was already rich in indigenous peoples of the lower Mississippi River Valley who were not enslaved, they also participated in the drumming and the dancing and the cultural practices happening on Congo Square. And out of that, you have the birth of jazz and the birth of Southern foodways, specifically like gumbo and jambalaya and all of those different things, and the birth of the Mardi Gras Indians. Because remember, New Orleans was a French colony, Louisiana was a French colony, and so they participated in French Carnival, like in Paris. But also, you have to remember that Catholicism was used as a weapon of colonization. So most of those who were enslaved practiced this religion. And the way colonizers, white people, were able to spread Catholicism was by syncretizing it with indigenous religious practices, which is why when you go to countries like Cuba and they're practicing Santeria, you see a lot of Catholic images, or you see the same thing in Brazil or in Trinidad and Tobago, and you see all of these relics. All of this history has come together, and this is what you see with the Mardi Gras Indians. It comes out of the procession culture of, yes, Parisian Carnival, but also Catholic procession culture when they would have different feast days and parades. But that was mixed with the warrior culture of indigenous tribes, as well as those of the enslaved Africans who were able to maintain their cultural practices because of how France operated New Orleans as a colony. So then it wasn't until the Louisiana Purchase in 1803, and the rush of Americans coming into this place and saying, hold up, what are you doing with these people? And then Americans have been wont to do, saying, well, if you think you can do that, we can do it better. And so once Americans took over the colony of Louisiana and the city of New Orleans, even though they despised Mardi Gras, they decided to hold their own parade and to formalize it. And then that's also where you see the outgrowth of these white supremacist aspects of Mardi Gras culture. So when you think about Mardi Gras, a lot of people may think about, Bourbon Street, downtown, French Quarter, all of these parades. But when you think about Mardi Gras for Black people, especially with the Indians and the baby dolls and the Skull and Bones gang and all of these other elements, those things happen outside of popular culture, as they always did, as they always had since the earliest days of the city of New Orleans and the Louisiana colony. I hope that answers your question.
It answers it perfectly, so much so. A very dear friend and local Western Massachusetts-based writer, visual artist made a comment saying like how your process is informing the way that she can start her process writing her nonfiction historical memoir. So I'm like, yay, I love that this is inspiring others. I like to talk about this quote from Kathleen McAllister about Mardi Gras Indians. Excuse me. Thank you, COVID. Williams' concise book effectively synthesizes numerous primary and secondary sources into an excellent overview of the origins of Mardi Gras tribes and the reasons for their continued endurance, particularly recommended for libraries looking to add to collections of Black American cultural traditions. The past couple of episodes, we talked about accessing stories and like the archive and libraries and what needs to be there so that people can access these particular works. So which section of the library would you like to see Mardi Gras Indians show up in and why? And why the archives and secondary sources of material used to craft this particular narrative? Like I know you talked a little bit about which I did not realize, that there was not much written about these populations and that there were white voices that kind of written on these. And I was like, oh, okay.
Where would I like to see it? I mean, I'm not sure how accessible this text is, even though I've tried to write it in an accessible way. But this is a story that you have to want to know to go find it, right? And I don't mean that in a way that it's an esoteric subject. I mean that in a way that a lot of people, if they are familiar with New Orleans or if they go to the city and they see somebody masked Indian, may just think that it's something pretty and that it's something that happens in the city and that's part of the city culture, but may not interrogate further as to why they do this, nor do they know that these men, women, and children spend an entire year hand sewing a suit that you think is just pretty, or that, and let alone that it tells a story, right? So you have to want to know this story and to uncover this history. It's not something that, as I said, will be easily accessible. However, I do think that as we think about the field of African American, Africana studies, Indigenous studies in this country, that it could be used as a textbook to help introduce students to other parts of not only American history, but African American history and Indigenous American history, and how that history has endured and those cultural mainstays have thrived despite the oppression of white supremacy and despite the demand that America makes that the people who are different assimilate. So I do think it does live in like that fourth floor, back corner, research study kind of area of the library. I'm not naive to think that, it's going to be on the first floor with all the commercial to fiction things. However, I do think there is a place for it in, in scholarly circles and in academic circles and, in high school and college curriculums.
Nice. So I'm going to jump ahead a question. Mardi Gras Indians is published by LSU Press, which is an academic press based at Louisiana State University. Excuse me. I believe that publishing work like this when a university press uniquely puts it into the hands of scholars and professors, meaning that the text can be taught in college and university classrooms, becoming a part of higher education curricula, which further legitimizes the importance of the text. So, can you talk a little bit about the relationship with LSU Press? You mentioned earlier that they identified you. And what do you hope to leverage career-wise with this relationship?
Everything. No. So yeah, as I mentioned in the preface and I talk about in my forthcoming episode on Black Unpublished, I was minding my own business. I was out here trying to freelance and make some money as a self-published indie author who had left her television career and was leveraging that into like a freelance journalist career as I tried to figure out how to make these books work on the side. Everything I had written up until this point has been fiction, and then I have a poetry collection as well. So I had done this freelance piece, and pitched it to a lot of places, got a lot of rejections, and the Bitter Southerner said yes. That piece went live in February of 2020, and then it went up. I got my little check, and I forgot about it, right? As I'm minding my business, and then I get an email from the acquisitions editor of LSU Press. Her name is Jenny, and it really just said, hey, I saw your story. We're doing the series of books about Louisiana culture. Would you be interested in writing for us? And so as a self-published author since 2017, who doesn't have an agent, who has no entry into the traditional industry, who's really just out here hustling these books and these words any way that I can, and created a podcast to give other authors like me a platform, my answer is, hell yeah, I want to write the book. Like, it didn't matter what the book was going to be about, right? I'm just going to write the book. Because it was going to be my first traditionally published title. So that gave me a distinction of validation that I didn't have from my own company, New Reads Publications, right? So even though I've started my own publishing company and have published others, I still have this bit of imposter syndrome that it's not enough because it's not been validated and co-signed by someone else. That's my own issues for me and my therapist. We don't have to dig into that right now.
But it's just so interesting that you mentioned having imposter syndrome, because I'm like, when you reached out to me to be on the series, I was like, what? I'm like, Nikesha's extremely accomplished and an amazing podcaster and writer herself. She wants to be on Black Writers Read. Okay.
Be everywhere somebody will have me, okay?
Yes.
So yeah, like they really reached out and asked me. We had I think Jeannie and I, we did a Zoom or had a conversation on the phone, I don't remember. And I really was like, she's just like, you want to write about red beans and rice again? I was like, I don't think that's a whole book. I don't. Right?
Yeah.
I think the essay is kind of one and done. And I had written a previous essay about gumbo that went up on Eater. Again, I think that was one and done. And I'm not like a food writer. I'm gonna leave that to Toni Tipton Martin because she's really excellent at that. But I was really interested in writing about the Indians. I think my first inkling of what they were and who they were, not as if they're a thing, was in the show Treme. And so I was intrigued. And so she was like, well, writing about the Indians can be hard. It's hard to get into that community. They're very secretive and this, that, and the third. And then you have to have images to go with the book. And I was like, yeah, I still want to do it. And then once, I talked to my mom, she was like, well, that's the only thing I can help you with. So, it's that or nothing, basically. And that's really just how it went. And my relationship has been good because I think I'm still naive into the ways that publishing works, especially traditional publishing. Like, I don't know what it is to have a deal with HarperCollins or whatever the case may be, and go through that process. I only know what my process has been as a self-published author, and I know what my process has been with LSU. So like, I don't have any disillusionment or disenfranchisement about what one is better than the other. Like, I'm here for the party.
Nice. And this, such great segues. This goes into my next question about like the milieu of your work. So your fiction work, Mardi Gras Indians, situates marginalized communities in a very unique way. In your artist statement on your website, you write that your work is, and I'm directly quoting here because I think it's very brilliant, Attuned to stories that were and were not covered in regards to Black women, specifically stories such as breast cancer rates, maternal death rates, infant mortality, stand your ground, police brutality, sexual assault, domestic violence, and more. You end your artist statement with, as I continue to develop as a literary artist and a voice in the Black community, it is my goal to create a body of work that invalidates the perception that Black people and Black women specifically are a monolith. I want to continue to explore, detail, and record the experiences of all Black women until their presence is widely recognized. Their humanity promotes empathy, their place and right to be in the world is never questioned, and their story is universal. How, if at all, is your own identity rendered in your work, and how do you show up for yourself and for those you write on in your work?
That's a good question. Child. I know I write about Black women, Black girls, Black mothers, Black children, because that was what I am, that is who I am, and that is what I and who I have birthed, right? So my community starts, and I don't want this to sound selfish or egotistical, but it starts within myself and then expands out from there. So then what am I seeing? What am I observing? What am I witnessing? What am I hearing? And again, I mentioned my first career was as a television news producer. I spent 11 years in newsrooms writing TV news in the state of Florida. So that's Trayvon Martin and Jordan Davis. And so I remember as I was conceiving and working on my debut novel For Women, those were the stories that I was writing in my job. But my question then was, where are the Black women? Not the screaming mothers, not the grieving mothers. Where are the Black women that this has happened to, and why don't we know their names? Why don't we know the Tatiana Jeffersons and the Ayanna Stanleys and the Sandra Blands and the Rakia Boyds and the Renisha McBrides? Why can't we call their names like George Floyd and Trayvon Martin and Jordan Davis and Tamir Rice and Freddie Ray, right? And so like that's where my purview always starts with, where am I in the story? Because as a child and you're reading stories, you look for yourself, yes? That's why the internet has gone crazy over Halle Bailey being Ariel. But Black girls are saying, oh my gosh, I can be a mermaid.
Yeah.
So where am I in the story? And as Toni Morrison said, if you do not see the story that you wish to read, you must write it. So I wasn't seeing the story that I wanted to read, nor was I seeing the real life accounts of the stories that I wanted to present in my newsroom and on my newscast. I got a whole 30 minutes or an hour of television I get to be in charge over, and yet I don't see the story that's just important as the Black man's story that's been shot down or killed or whatever. Not that those are our only stories, but you see where I'm coming from. Right. I wanted to know. And so I made a fiction version. And so as I continue to build as a writer and as an artist, I will always center Black women. What's funny is that Mardi Gras Indians is a very male-dominated and masculine culture, and yet the women are still there, always helping, always by the side, and masking in their own right.
Nice. Oh my gosh, this conversation is so awesome. So you kind of talked a little bit about this in your response. Our environments and communities can inform our creative practice. How do your communities, families, learning experiences, travels, and everything in between inform your writing and approach to storytelling, especially given, and I'm so glad that you mentioned it in the conversation, about being a television news producer and a television news producer in the time that you were. I'm like, oh my God, how? Like, ooh, okay. How has all of the things that you've walked through and been through and have been inform your writing now?
I've recognized that everything that I have done informs what I am doing or will do next in some of the most benign and inconsequential ways that would matter to no one else but me, right? So there was a story that I wrote around the time that I was preparing to go write do the research for Mardi Gras Indians in New Orleans about American Beach, which was a Black-owned beach just north of where I live in Jacksonville.
Wow.
And that story has roots in 1790 Senegal. Yes.
Wow.
That's how far. So the beach was bought by a man named Abraham Lincoln Lewis and his co-op. His first wife was the great granddaughter of a woman whose enslaved name was Anna Kingsley. Anna Kingsley was kidnapped from Senegal by Zephaniah Kingsley in the late 1790s when she was 13 years old, and went on to be emancipated by Zephaniah and to run Kingsley Plantation, where she emancipated her family members and used it as a refuge during the Civil War. So in writing that story and that history and what has happened, not only to Anna Kingsley and that history, but American Beach specifically, whose descendants include Dr. Janetta Besh Cole, former president of Spelman and Bennett College, I began to think that, as Black people in America, we are taught that we have no culture, no history, no past, no kin, no country, none of those markers of identity before we arrived here. But doing a story about American Beach showed me that's a lie. Yes. And then going months later to do the research on Mardi Gras Indians reinforced that notion that that's a lie. We have country, we have culture, we have community, we have kin, we have foodways, we have music, we have song, we have dance. And if you open your eyes and pay attention to the way Black American culture looks now, you will see that it resembles culture of Black people across the diaspora and back to Africa. And so in having that in my mind that, I kept hearing this refrain in my head, all was not lost, because you think that everything was lost in the transatlantic slave trade. That's the way that it's taught, that everything that we were, everything that we had, all of that was lost in the slave trade, never to be recovered. But that's not true. It's not true. And so this book, Mardi Gras Indians, proves that it's not true. And so, as I said, everything that I've done informs everything that I am doing. And so all of my years in the newsroom helped me write my novels. My years of freelancing helped me write this nonfiction book. And, having my children has informed how I'm working on projects to come in the future.
Nice. So speaking of projects in the future and everything you're working on, I want to take an opportunity to give you a garden of flowers. So for people who are joining us who have not had a chance to go to her website yet, she is brilliant with branding, from her headshots and the way in which they look and the way in which she looks at the camera, to the branding of her name on the website, New Rights. There's just so much that, and your social media presence as well. There's just so much that I feel like in this whole, I'm like, imposter syndrome, really? I feel like you can even teach a workshop on how to brand yourself as an author. I love that. And so I don't even know if this is necessarily a question, but just taking this opportunity. But was there a process? Did you work with someone in terms of coming up with your unique brand, or you just pulled from all of your experiences working with others for a brand, given that you were a journalist? How did you get your presence so succinctly tight as an author?
I think it started with, I thought my name was too long for people to type it into a search bar and look up a website for NikeshaEliseWilliams.com, which may or may not be true, but that was my thought. So I was like, let's just shorten it to New Rights. So it's Nikesha Elise Williams Rights. It's who I am and it's what I do, period. So that was newrights.com. Very, very simple to me. The headshots, it was just me and a photographer. I know his name is Tony. And it's I came, I got my makeup done and did my hair, put on my shirt, and we played for a half an hour. Cause
wow.
Cause we knew each other. So we played for a half an hour, and those are kind of the shots that you got. as far as everything else, I feel like I'm very good at coming up with the concept of a thing. And that's probably from my years in television, where, when you work in television, you have to write the show and envision it before it goes on air. And so all of these different elements, video, graphics, sound, uh, chirons, all those different things, you have to think about how that looks. And so I think for myself, became very good at thinking about how something looks, how something sounds, the way it played, with other things that were already in the market, to be able to brand those things. So like Black and Published was really one of those kind of downloads that I got, where I didn't want to do a podcast. I felt like there were already people doing podcasts about Black writers. And I was like, I don't want to do this, but if I did, I'd call it Black and Published. And then it stayed with me, and then I kind of did it.
Yes.
So it's just the way that my brain works. And I think what's surprising to me is that I find that other people don't think like that.
Wow.
And so I was like, well, it just makes sense to me. That's the only way that I can explain it. Like, it's just the way that things make sense to me. And I'm beginning to realize that it seems very strategic, and a lot of it seems very random and organic, like even down to me starting my own publishing company in imprint.
Wow.
When I had to make the decision to self-publish my debut novel, I was going through Create Space and all of these different things. And I was like, I don't want another company's name on my work. If I'm going to do it and I'm going to pay for it, my name's going to be on it.
Wow.
And so I was like, all right, we're going to call it New Reads Publication. So yes, the new are my initials, but then it also is much more than me. This is where you can come get new reads from anybody, not just me. And so like, that's how that branding, works and plays. So like, yes, a lot of things are a play on my name and my initials, but the new stands for so much more than Nikesha Elise Williams.
Oh, that's so cool. Oh my God. Oh wow. I love that. And then like I'm curious, who else have you published?
Oh goodness. So my first author was a friend of mine. Her name is Jessica Lynn, and her novel was called Kissing Frogs. It came out in 2019. Then I have two nonfiction authors, Monica Brown and Angel Henry, who both did. Monica's book was more of a personal story of how she climbed the corporate ladder, called Only One: How to Be a Badass Boss in
Wow.
Corporate America. And then Angel's story was very data and research driven, called Dents in the Ceiling. And it was about, how as Black women are trying to climb the corporate ladder, because both Monica and Angel work in tech,
Oh
the
wow.
different issues that they'll come across. And so Dents in the Ceiling refers to, they always talk about, you have to break the glass ceiling. And she was like, well, yeah, white women break the glass ceiling, but Black women and brown women and Indigenous women are stuck under like layers of concrete that you have to, like, you can only dent. You can't shatter that. You can only dent that ceiling. So I published her book. I published another fiction author. Her name is Benguni. Her novel is called Looking for Hope, and it's like a coming of age story set in the late 1950s to early 60s, about
Wow.
a young girl who goes on the run with her father after he commits this like heinous crime, and her like coming of age through that process. And then I have a poetry
Oh.
collection that I published by a great friend of mine. Her name is Ebony Payne English. She's a slam poet. Published her third collection, Bits and Pieces. And then I'm working on another project with an after school program and these kids who've written a book that's coming out this year. And I may have another author as well. We just had a consultation yesterday. So I've published a lot of people. It's been about 2 books a year since 2019, in addition to my own
Wow.
books that I published. So I've got like 6, 7 authors now under my roster. So we're building, we're doing our little thing.
Can we talk about having some of your people on here? I would love
Yeah.
to. Yes. Especially the coming of age story, 1950s and 60s. Like, what? I went like,
Yeah, yeah.
ding.
I will text Benguni after this and send her your information. I'll connect you to. She loved it. She loved to. I'm sure she would.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Nikesha. So, in terms of your own work, given the books that you wrote and published, if we're looking for an introductory and an entry point, which of your books would you recommend people to read first and why?
I always tell people either to start with four women, which is my debut novel,
Oh,
or
wow.
to start with my last novel, which is Beyond Bourbon Street. Both of those books I hold really close to me for very different reasons. Four Women, I conceived in like 2013, and I didn't publish till 2017, though I think the
Wow.
inklings of that novel began in like 2010. And I've told this story several times, but I wrote a short story in 2010, didn't do anything with it. Had an idea for another character in like 2012, didn't do anything with it. And then when I was between jobs in my news career, I saw a contest for called Critique My Novel. You send in the first 10,000 words of a novel, and they'll give you professional feedback. And I was like, okay, I'll do this. And so that's how Four Women started. I took those two ideas that I had from the past, put them together in a document, added two more characters, and kind of began. And I just was kind of writing, freestyling. I had no outline, no plot structure. I just was writing what felt natural in these four different characters and these four different voices for about 18 chapters. I knew there would be a crime, wasn't sure of what it was going to be, how it was going to unfold. And it was because of my work in the newsroom during the times of the killing of Trayvon Martin and the killing of Jordan Davis and the trials for their killers that, I really focused in on. I want to talk about Black women, stand your ground, and all of these other issues that are layered through that book. And so I would usually tell people to start there. Or I would say, if you want to start with my later work, start with Beyond Bourbon Street, which was my last novel that came out in 2020. But really, Beyond Bourbon Street started when I was in undergrad. I was in the honors English program at FSU, and to graduate with honors, you had to write a thesis. And so I wrote this like little novella called From Pillar to Post, where the characters who are in Beyond Bourbon Street were the characters in that novella. And it was after the birth of my son that I started to think about those characters again. I think it was around the 10th anniversary of Katrina, because it's also set in New Orleans. And I was like, I wonder what they're doing. And I wonder what their lives look like. And so I brought them up to the present day. I went and dug out my novella and like put parts of that backstory in the current novel and wrote the story from there. So like those are like my two babies. So I hold those very close. I would tell people to start either with Four Women or start with Beyond Bourbon Street for the fiction side. If you want the nonfiction, then start with Mardi Gras Indians.
Nice. Just have a couple more questions before we wrap up this afternoon. So you are a fellow podcaster, Black and Publishes in the middle of season 3. Combining your podcast, you talked a little bit about this in terms of what you hope to do with this podcast, but combining your podcast, your journalism career, your creative writing career, what do you hope your work and unique voice adds to the literary canon and the culture?
That Black people got something to say. That's really it. And I mean, that sounds very simple, but when you hear, especially when I hear all of the stories of all of the authors who have come on my show and their publishing journeys, some have seemed very charmed, but I have a lot of authors like, 14 years, 12 years, 10 years, 6 years for one book, and everything that they've had to navigate, the gaslighting, the imposter syndrome, the institutional bias of publishing, because there aren't enough authors, enough Black and brown authors, Indigenous authors, Asian authors who are successful, they don't get as much support. Or when their books are big and they do break, and then they're marketed as everything but a Black author, and they're not marketed to Black media. So I want people to see my work and my contribution in the literary landscape, from the podcast to my own literary works, as just another patch in the quilt of the Black literary canon. And not that it should be a Black literary canon and a literary canon. We are part of the literary canon and we make it up. And so it's to normalize, I guess, in a way that Black stories can be universal. Black people, Black women, Black men, Black non-binary folks can be the everyman, and anybody can come to these stories and see themselves in it, whether or not they're the same skin tone or not.
Yeah, and actually you mentioned like why Black writers read actually sustained, not started, because this actually was initially supposed to be a one-day thing in response to He Who Shall Not Be Named. Juneteenth of 2020, wanting to do that rally in Tulsa, Oklahoma. And people, because I'm a local artist activist, and people tagged me on Facebook, Nicole, you need to do something. And I'm like, I got a week and we are still in lockdown. What can I do? And I ended up putting together a night of, 16 authors from around the country. And we read for like 3.5 hours. And then people were like, you need to do this again. And I started doing it each month. And like, one of the things that I think of for my branding, because you and I, we're two of maybe like at least 5 podcasts that I know, including Black Writers Studio with the Hurston Wright Foundation, that talks about Black authors in the way that we do. And for me, the thing that I want to be unique is how we shift the canon, and the reason why that came up is because I'm also an educator and I teach traditionally in major works classes. And you'll appreciate this as someone with an English background, English literature. And like, I would be told, you have to teach of the canon, you have to teach the Iliad and Frankenstein and Canterbury Tales. And I'm like, but what about Toni Morrison and Zora Neale Hurston and Richard Wright? Like, we are, and they're like, well, that's the Black literary canon. And I'm like, hold up, let me show you all these wars.
These right, authors, like that's the literary canon, not the Black literary canon. There's one canon and we are in it.
Exactly.
Period.
Exactly. And so on mine, I talk to people who either, like for myself, I've chosen so far, well, I took myself out of publishing because of the rejection that I was getting, but then talking to people who have made the deliberate choice of not being published, or people who are choosing particular avenues. Like my thing is, I like to talk about everything that exists within the canon. And I'm also hoping too, there's a couple of authors that I've reached out to because I want to get some Afro-Latin voices on. I want to get people from the motherland. Like I want, like, this is legit the African diaspora. So I'm hoping to get that way soon. And the last question that I have for you, Nikesha, is, besides your book coming out on October 5th and then the novel that you're working on, what's next for you, and how can the Black Writers Read community support you on this journey?
Really, what's next is the novel that I'm working on. I've been up since 4:30 this morning because I woke up and I was like, time to go back to sleep. And then my people started talking. I was like, all right, fine, I'll write this chapter. Like, I'm in the middle of my second draft of this book. It's the second year that I've been working on it. And so I'm trying to weave it together and make it make sense. And so, like, that's really what's next for me. This book is one that I hope that I am not self-publishing, only because I feel like it needs more than what I alone and my small team can just give it. I feel like it needs a community of editors and champions and agents and things like that. And also, you know, we have to be honest and talk about elevation. I've done a lot as a self-published author. I've done a lot as an indie publisher. But, you know, if we're going to talk about elevation, I feel like this is the natural and necessary next step. It started with, you know, this book, Mardi Gras Indians, from LSU Press. And as I mentioned, that is like a notch of validation for me. And, you know, I can continue doing my own thing self-published, but, you know, I need to be able to reach readers who don't live in Jacksonville, and without me having to spend an arm and a leg to go pop up at a book festival and stand in the cold and be rained on to hand sell my book. I've done that. I've done a lot of that. I've flown lots of places to sell 15, 20 books and called it a win on my dime. Like, let's keep it 100. However, I want to elevate, I want to escalate, and I want to tell stories that I've always told, but haven't reached a larger audience. And call it ambition, call it ego, but that's where we're going.
Yeah, and I'm glad that you say that, because that's the other thing too, that people don't understand, the labor and the money that goes into self-publishing. Like with Black Writers Read, I'm so fortunate that I, you know, have a strong community. After doing an Indiegogo campaign, I'm now at like 60% paying on my own. And so people are like, oh, you have to pay to go to book festivals, you have to fly and all this other stuff. So I'm like, I'm glad that you say that. And for those who are watching, and especially for upcoming guests, if you know of a publisher or an agent, or I have people, especially people who I'm working with in the future. I'm going to send emails and link you to people because I'm glad that you have that ego, because you do need a big name publisher so you can like actually take the load off and actually just only work on the craft as opposed to the craft and the business. No, like you need to write. You only need to write and like have somebody else work about, finding the publisher and finding the artwork and getting you, like the press tour. Somebody else needs to be doing that.
Yeah, they do. I agree, but we're not there
Yeah.
yet. So I have to continue working on the craft. So when this is over, it's back to the manuscript.
Yeah. So, Nikesha, thank you so much for joining us this afternoon and also stumbling through. We had a couple of technical issues at the very beginning and also my coughing. So, it was so great to finally meet you. I look forward to getting Mardi Gras Indians, your novel, and also continuing to support you via Black and Publish.
Thank you so much, Nicole, for having me. I truly appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you. And coming up next week, as I promised people at the very beginning, Black Writers Read, we're going to be hosting people every couple of weeks. I will have on award-winning children's book, adult fiction, essay, professor, author Trisha Elam Walker next Sunday, which is October 9th. Yeah, October 9th at noon. So I will see you all back here. And thank you all so much for continuing to ensure that Black authors continue to matter.